Does computing need to be decolonized? What might that mean? Doesn't that presume that computing is colonial? And how can that be, given that colonialism, as a phenomenon tied up with imperial structures of domination and settlement, is a thing of the past? How can computing be colonial if the age of empires is over and we live in a post-colonial world? To make the case for decolonizing computing, I clearly need to show how computing is colonial, at least in some sense. But before I can do that, I need to set out what I mean by computing. I take the view that computing in general, or as a rule, is a socio-technical phenomenon. That is, computing as a practice involving the design, construction, maintenance, and use of devices and systems emerging within a social, by which I mean political, economic, and cultural context, but also shaping that context. In short, computing is an entanglement of the social and the technical. But even if that is computing as a rule, it is important to appreciate that rules tend to have exceptions. And here they refer to those specific areas within computing that are more technical in nature, such as theories and models of computation, the mathematics of computability, and the various formal and logical proofs and theorems associated with them. But even if we accept that computing is a socio-technical phenomenon in general, how does that support the claim that computing is colonial? To answer that question, we need to understand a little bit about the history of computing, the world in which it emerged, and the world in which it continues to develop. Let me start with the world. Colonialism, as a project of European political domination involving settlement, formally ended with the national liberation and independence, or decolonization, movements of the 1960s. Yet the modernity which colonialism engendered persists, albeit transformed under the condition of postmodernity, which has meant the persistence of certain colonial ways of knowing and being based on systems of categorization, classification, and taxonomization, and the embedding of these in practices, artifacts, and technologies. It is these ongoing legacy structures and practices, what is referred to as coloniality, which persist in the contemporary post-colonial era, notwithstanding the formal end of colonialism, that I suggest need to be considered in relation to the question concerning whether computing is colonial. While recognizing that the history of computing, like other histories, is a contested terrain, and duly acknowledging the entanglement of history with geography and both with power, it is a fact that computers, programming, artificial intelligence, the internet, and ICTs all emerged in the West, primarily Britain and the US, against the backdrop of inter-European military conflict, the Second World War, and post-war ideological conflict, the Cold War, both of which were relationally entangled with colonized populations along what African American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois referred to as the color line. For this reason, I suggest that the histories and geographies of computing and colonialism are entangled, insofar as the origins of computing are tied to European come Western imperial projects and militarized industrialized contexts whose legacy effects persist in the contemporary post-colonial era. In this connection, and by way of some examples, consider resource extraction in the Congo, which has gone on for centuries and which continues to power computing in the global north, commencing with the extracting of copper for computing systems during the Cold War, and more recently cobalt for lithium-ion batteries and coltan for mobile devices. Tracking supply chains under racial capitalism affords us an insight into the coloniality of computing as resources, patterns of consumption, and the production of waste create circuits involving the core and periphery of the world system. Researchers and practitioners adopting a decolonial computing perspective are required, at a minimum, to do the following. Firstly, consider their positionality, both in terms of who they are and where they are located, when designing, building, researching, or theorizing about computing and ICT phenomena. Secondly, embrace the decolonial option as a political, ethical stance, attempting to think through what it might mean to design, build, maintain, and use computing and ICT systems with and for those situated at the margins and peripheries of the world system, with a view to undermining the asymmetry of local global power relations.